the story doesn't end where Mary comes running in and saying, Jesus is risen. What about the disciples? What was going to happen to them? You see, they were terrified. They were very, very afraid that the Roman soldiers were going to come after them and maybe crucify them, that maybe they'd kill them in a different way. And besides that, they just didn't know what they had to do. So all of them kind of went back to their own homes. In our story, Peter and John are together and a couple of their friends, and they're busy talking about Jesus. And one of them says, you know, I was so sure that Jesus was our Messiah. I was positive. I mean, he never did anything bad. He was the most loving, the kindest, the most intelligent man I have ever met. Just think of all the hundreds and hundreds of people he healed, and all the blind people that can now see, and the deaf people that can hear, and he raised people from the dead. I just don't understand. Where did we go wrong? And they cried. They were so sad that Jesus was gone. He was dead, and they didn't know what to do. Peter says, John, you were there at the crucifixion. I'm sad to say that I was too cowardly to go, but you were there. What is this that I hear now, that they put a crown on Jesus? And John said, oh yes, that was very, very sad. He said, they tell me that Pilate asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews. And Jesus had said to him, yes, it is as you say, I am the king of the Jews. And you know what Pilate did, says John? He says, Pilate made up a big signboard, and it says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Oh, he said, you should have heard the scribes and the teachers and the Pharisees. They were so upset when he wrote that. They said, no, 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 you can't write that. You have to say, he says, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. Leave it. Well, some very bad person, to make a big point, got some thorns and thistles and twisted it all together in a circle, and he slammed it down on Jesus' head, and so it looked like a crown. And there he hung on the cross with this crown hanging over his forehead, and he was bleeding. It really, really hurt. And underneath the sign that said, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Well, Peter said, then what happened? Like, after he died, who took him down? Well, John said, after he died, of course, it was just about time for the Sabbath, and we all know that these guys can't be left hanging on the cross for the Sabbath, and so what the soldiers did was they came along and one of them stuck a sword in Jesus' side just to make sure he was good and dead. And then Joseph, he's a guy that comes from Arimathea. He was the one that came and took Jesus down and put him in his tomb. Said one of the men, I still don't understand. Why didn't Jesus just call his angels or call God? He could have had 10,000 angels come and rip him off that cross, and then everybody would have believed that he was the Christ, the Son of God. John said he did just the opposite. You won't believe it. Well, maybe you will, knowing Jesus, says John. Jesus hung there on the cross in terrible pain, and he says, I watched. His eyes just kind of roamed over all the soldiers that were there and all those people that were making fun of him. And you know what he said? He said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they are doing. Just then, John had just finished saying that when there was a loud knocking and banging on the door, and Mary Magdalene burst into the room. Jesus is alive! Jesus is alive! She shouted. I saw some angels. Jesus is alive. Well, with that, Peter and John separated from the group and they ran out the door, followed by Mary. Peter and John raced to the tomb. John got there first and peeked inside the door, and sure enough, there was nobody there. But Peter went right inside the tomb. John, he called. He was gasping for breath. Come on in, you've got to see this. And so the two men went inside the tomb, and there were the bandages that had been used to be wrapped around Jesus. And they were laying on the stone where he had laid, and the cloth that had been laid over his face, the burial cloth, it was neatly folded and laying where Jesus' head had been. And the two men were still out of breath, and by this time Mary Magdalene showed up, and they were totally astonished. John said to Mary, come on over here, tell us again what happened. Well, said Mary, a bunch of us, me and Mary, you know, James's mom, and Salome and Joanna, and well, there were a few others. I don't remember who else was there, but we came really early in the morning. We thought we would just come and prepare Jesus' body for the burial so that it would be all ready. We had our spices, everything with us, and one of us, I think Joanna, said, so who's going to roll the rock away? We should have brought the men with us. And she said, we came and the rock was laying on the ground the way you see it. And she said there were a couple of soldiers laying on the ground even. And we came closer, and there was an angel, and he said, what are you looking for? Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He is risen. Go and tell the disciples. So she said, I don't know what happened to the others, but I just thought you guys needed to know that Jesus is risen. Well, Peter and John talked a little bit longer, and then they left. And Mary was all by herself, crying and feeling very sad and very confused. She said in her head, I know I saw an angel, and I know he said Jesus isn't here, but I don't understand. And she peeked inside the tomb, and there inside the tomb were two angels. And you'll have to imagine they were inside. One was sitting where Jesus' feet had been, and one was sitting where his head had been. And they looked at Mary, peeking in the door, and they said, who are you looking for? He's not here. He is risen. Well, she was still more puzzled, and so she turned to walk away, and Jesus came forward. But she didn't recognize him as Jesus. And he said, woman, whom are you searching for? Why are you here? And Mary Magdalene, whom Jesus had healed from 7 demons, didn't recognize him still. She thought he was the gardener, and she said, sir, if you have taken him away, will you tell me where you put him so that I can go and get him? And Jesus said, Mary. And then she recognized him, and she flew to him, and she grabbed him, and he said, go and tell my disciples that I am living. Go and tell them. And so she did. Later that day, the disciples were gathered together in a big room. The doors were locked, the windows were locked. They were so afraid that the soldiers were going to come and take them away, and they still didn't know what to do. And so they were all gathered there talking and chatting, and all of a sudden, even though the doors were locked, Jesus appeared. And they all recognized him, and so, of course, everybody gathered around, and he said, peace be with you. And he showed them his hands. He held out his hands so they could see the holes where the nails had been. and he pulled aside his tunic so that they could see the hole in his side where the sword had pierced him. And they were so excited, and they believed in him. And Jesus went to the table, and he took a piece of bread, and he broke it, and they had some bread together. Well, later, when Jesus was gone, the one missing disciple, Thomas, showed up. Why he wasn't there earlier, the Bible doesn't say. But Thomas came in, and they said, "You missed him. Jesus was here." And Thomas said, "That's not possible." Well, they said it was. The doors were locked, the windows were locked, and all of a sudden he was here, and he showed us his hands, he showed us the hole in his side, and Thomas says, "I don't believe you." He says, "I don't know who it was, but I don't believe you. If I cannot put my hands into the holes in his hands, and if I cannot put my hands into his side, then I will not believe." What could the disciples say? Thomas, he totally doubted that the person they saw was Jesus. Well, later that week, they were gathered again, still trying to figure out what to do, when Jesus came again into the midst of the room, and he said, "Peace be with you." And he called Thomas over. "Thomas," he said, "I have to show you something." And he said, "See my hand." And Thomas took Jesus' hand in his own, and Jesus said, "Put your finger in the hole." And he did. He put his finger into the hole. And then the other hand, and he put his finger into the hole. And Jesus pulled aside his tunic, and he said, "Now, touch this place where the sword pierced me." And Thomas did. And he said, "My Lord and my God, now I believe." And Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Thomas. You have seen and you believe." But he said, "Blessed also will be those people who do not see me, but who still believe." And boys and girls, that's us. Jesus said we are blessed. Even though we don't see him, we still pray to him and we talk to him, and we believe that he's Jesus, that he's the Son of God.